Well, hello. We're here to talk at Fort Pickett, Virginia, and we're here to talk about rare, threatened, and endangered species and how you would manage those species while planning some forestry or silvicultural activities. The reason we've picked Fort Pickett is that it's in southwest or southeast Virginia, and that they have several endangered rare species that we will be examining throughout the day today to give you different examples. First of all, when we talk about rare, threatened, and endangered species, we're not only talking about federally listed species, but also state species. Obviously, if you're working on federal land, all species listed under the Endangered Species Act are something you have to consider. As we will talk about more as this module goes along, there's a system with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service called IPAC that helps you understand some of the management activities and some of the requirements while managing endangered species on federal land. For today, we're going to go over both a plant species, a mammal species, and a fish species throughout Fort Pickett. One thing to be aware of, depending on the state, it's not just federal species that you're interested in, but also state-listed species. Please, when you're doing this, you'll have to consult your local state and local state agencies to see if you need to manage those. But for this, we will be working and examining species that occur in this oak pine forest, as you can see around us, and we will go through the different decisions and different things that you may have to do when planning silvicultural activities in a system such as this. Okay, we've been using Fort Pickett as an example in case studies, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a background on Fort Pickett. Fort Pickett is a Army National Guard Maneuver Training Center located in southeast Virginia. It's approximately 42,000 acres in size, and it is a mix of woodlands, forest, and open grasslands. Most of the cover type here is like a oak pine and oak hardwood cover types, but there are some bottomland hardwoods, and actually is a great variety of different habitats throughout Fort Pickett. One key thing about Fort Pickett, which is probably one of the organizing principles of its composition, is disturbance, and that's going to be very important as it relates to some of the endangered species. With military training, silvicultural activities, and habitat maintenance, fire is a key part of the landscape here and provides a rather unique set of habitats, which if you're managing for different silvicultural treatments, that you have to take that into account. Fort Pickett is probably one of the most diverse landscapes in the Virginia Piedmont in terms of habitat, both from a plant and animal standpoint, and thus is a good place to have these case studies in order to teach a little bit about managing of endangered species. So when I'm referring to RTE species, these are in fact rare, threatened, and endangered. The rare species in that reference are not ones protected by the Endangered Species Act, but ones that could potentially be protected or on the list for consideration. The threatened and endangered part of it is ones that are listed under the Endangered Species Act and have actual federal protection. In species conservation, the rare species are ones we don't want going to the threatened or endangered status. So oftentimes we try to identify those and take proactive actions that would include silvicultural treatments to keep that species from becoming more rare and listed under the threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act. One thing that also applies to the Endangered Species Act is something called the 4D rule. I have mentioned it and will mention it in regards to the northern long-eared bat. The 4D rule only applies to species listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, and it allows for some flexibility and special rules by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for that species. You can't have management actions under the 4D rule if it's listed as endangered, only threatened. And for the northern long-eared bat, because habitat is not a limiting factor, but reproduction is, that is why a special rule restricting Silvicultural treatments in its range during the summer months, during its pup rearing months, is classified as a 4D rule. And then while you can do anything to that, not anything, but you can harvest or do silvicultural treatments of habitat outside that pup rearing season. One point I would like to make is that on federal land, all species are protected, whether they're plants or animals. But if you're working on private land, that only animals have the protection under the Federal Endangered Species Act. So it's important to know, obviously, where you're working and what species are protected. Now, at the same time, if you're depending on the state may have protection for plants on private land that federal protections don't have. So it's important to consult your state laws and regulations while planning these silvicultural activities. So what the IPAC system does, once you know the geographic location of where your project is going to occur, it's going to identify any listed species that are within a certain geographic distance of your location, whether you're in the critical habitat, or if there are migratory bird issues you need to consider. It doesn't tell you once and for all at your exact location that there are endangered species at that exact location, but that there are some within the region or within that habitat, and you have to do a further examination to see if your activities would in fact affect those endangered species. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the IPAC tool that we will be examining and practicing during this module. The IPAC tool has been developed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to help, as a project planning tool, to help people and natural resource professionals of all levels plan for management of potential endangered species. Now, it doesn't always encompass endangered species. It will encompass migratory birds and other natural resource issues that are for a particular location. As you will see when we're in the module, it uses a online GIS where you pinpoint where your project's going to occur, and will come up with a list of species that you potentially have to manage in your planning process. For instance, if we put our point where we are standing at Fort Pickett right now, it would automatically come up with the endangered species and plant species, Michaux sumac, endangered or threatened bat species, the northern long-eared bat, and an endangered fish, the Roanoke log perch. So if we were to do a silvicultural activity at this particular location, we would have to assess whether any of those species are affected by changes to this habitat in particular. There is not always will any silvicultural activities be affecting these species. You just have to take account of those as you're planning your project. So hello, here we are at Fort Pickett as part of our field exercise. So from the IPAC exercise of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we've identified 3 species that we're going to do some field investigations today and discussions. One, a plant, Michaux sumac, where we'll talk more about how the habitat is affected by silvicultural activities. The second is a northern long-eared bat, where silvicultural activities don't necessarily affect the habitat, but when you perform those activities are restricted by time of year. And then the third are aquatic species, such as the Roanoke log perch and some of the potentially endangered mussels in the Nottoway River. Those species, while you're not going to always directly impact those through silvicultural actions, they will be impacted potentially indirectly through silvicultural actions and runoff and such. So those are the 3 species today that we're going to go around and investigate at Fort Pickett and discuss how different silvicultural treatments may affect those and how they may affect silvicultural treatments. So one of the species that we've been using as a case study is Michaux sumac. So I figured I'd give you a little bit of a background on Michaux sumac. It is a federally endangered species. It is actually a small shrub, and for those of you who are familiar with smooth sumac, it's very closely related to those two, and it is assumed that they speciated sometime after the last glacial period. Michaux sumac is very dependent on disturbance, primarily fire, but also silvicultural activities can be used to modify and improve Michaux sumac habitat. So it's not always a confrontation with this particular species, and in fact likes disturbance. The species is usually in fire maintained or open areas, but it does like an open oak hardwood forest. The species is dioecious, meaning it has both male and female stems, and thus you need both of those in a particular habitat to have reproduction. Okay, so if you were wanting to prescribe a silvicultural treatment here at Fort Pickett, you would go on the IPAC, and obviously because Michaux sumac is in the region, that's going to come up as a species you need to be concerned about. However, that is not the end of it. The thing to do at that point is understand what habitat Michaux sumac likes. Now, in this particular stand, a dense pine stand, as you can see, Michaux sumac does not prefer dense pine stands. So a little bit of that background research would let you know that that is probably not a species in this particular stand you need to be concerned about. However, Michaux sumac does prefer more open oak and hickory stands. So those stands, if you were prescribing a silvicultural treatment there, you would need to be concerned about and may even have to do a survey to guarantee that it's not there. So continuing our case study of Michaux sumac here at Fort Pickett, this is an instance where multiple objectives can be accomplished through silvicultural means. At Fort Pickett, one of the things that is very important, not only for training, but for Michaux sumac, is maintaining an open character of a forest such as this. In many locations, they will actually have silvicultural treatments that will thin the forest that not only benefits both Michaux sumac but military training. So this is how silvicultural practices can serve multiple objectives and not be in conflict with rare, threatened, and endangered species, but actually help rare, threatened, and endangered species. For Michaux sumac, you basically, because it's a shade intolerant species, it needs to have 40 square feet per acre or less in order to thrive. So silvicultural treatments that get to that particular goal, again, will benefit the species, benefit military training, and also provide lumber and fiber for the local market. For Michaux sumac, one of the most important things is maintaining kind of an open understory. As you can see, some of the understory is starting to move in here to this open oak stand. And so often what is used at Fort Pickett is fire or sometimes bush hogging, but fire is the preferred means by which to maintain the open character of these oak woodlands. And then if they become too dense or they want to open up other habitat for Michaux sumac and or military training, they will come and do silvicultural treatments to their particular stand. So one of the final points I want to make about Michaux sumac, the management for Michaux sumac and the silvicultural treatments are not designed to just benefit Michaux sumac. Many of these species that use these open oak woodlands are in fact, while they're not endangered, they're rare on the landscape in southeast Virginia. So these silvicultural treatments that thin the forest and have these oak woodlands have multiple objectives for Fort Pickett. Not just Michaux sumac and military training, but other species, both game and non-game, that may not be as common in the surrounding landscape. So these multiple objectives are key for the management at Fort Pickett. So one of the silvicultural treatments that is often used to maintain the open character of the system, both for military training and for Michaux sumac, is fire. As you can see, some regeneration and other vegetation is starting to fill in here. At this point, a silvicultural treatment using fire and or mechanical means, if for some reason you can't prescribe fire, will be used to maintain the open oak woodland here that is beneficial for both endangered species, other threatened species, and military training. So, okay, what we're doing now, we're changing from discussing Michaux sumac and some of the considerations you have with that when planning silvicultural treatments. That, with Michaux sumac, it's mostly about habitat. With bats, a species called the northern long-eared bat in particular, is a different considerations. As most of you probably know, bats are facing serious declines due to white nose syndrome, which is a fungus that attaches to the bat and tends to help reduce its ability to survive the winter. So obviously that's not something that's been caused by humans specifically. However, they are still part of the Endangered Species Act, and there's one bat called the northern long-eared bat which is threatened. Now with that, unlike Michaux sumac, everything that you see around here is habitat. Any size tree that's probably about 5 inches DBH or above is potential habitat for rearing pups for this bat. So with this particular species, it's not the habitat you need to be concerned about, it is the time of year. Because under the current 4D rule, which may change, but right now you're restricted from doing any sort of silvicultural treatment during the period of May to August, which is the pup rearing time. So unlike Michaux sumac, where you have to be concerned with habitat, with the bats you have to be concerned with time of year. Also at the same time, you don't necessarily, if you don't have to, want to take trees that might provide not hibernacular, but areas for pup raising. So in conclusion with the northern long-eared, it's a time of year thing, a temporal thing, not a habitat you have to consider. So one of the reasons for this time of year restriction for this bat is because any of these trees, and especially this one you see in the background, could be where they rear their pups. There's no way to come in here and do operations, say, oh, this one tree is where they are, don't disturb that, and we'll take the rest. Because the habitat is not the limiting factor with this species. Even if then after the pup rearing season is on, this whole area is clear cut and every tree taken, the bats that return the next year would simply go across the river or go to an adjoining stand because there's plenty of habitat. It's just unlike with some plant species and other species where you can go in and say, okay, I'm not going to disturb this one specific area. There's no way to know with all these trees out here whether there is a bat in any one tree rearing pups without some really detailed and frankly time-consuming and not altogether accurate data collection. So that is the reason for the time of year restriction. And since the habitat is not limiting, the bats can return to the region and find plenty of habitat even if a particular forest undergoes a silvicultural treatment during the non-pup rearing season. So for instance, when we're talking about trees that are important for northern long-eared bats in specific, it would be this tree right here where you can see a small opening, and you would think that that might be too small for a bat to utilize, but that a northern long-eared bat, which is a fairly small bat, can utilize that. The female will actually go in there and actually have its pups and raise its pups in that. So again, if you're prescribing silvicultural treatments, specifically where you're going to be leaving some trees, just as with other wildlife, leaving trees that have these defects or openings like this would be very important for this particular species. And again, you still cannot do any of the different silvicultural treatments during the pup rearing season, but even after that, if you leave trees like this would be very important to that species. So the final species we're going to use in our case study, or the final group of species, are aquatic species. So if you use the IPAC and you're planning a silvicultural treatment here at Fort Pickett, one of the things that would come up would be the Roanoke log perch, which is in the main stem of the Nottoway, which is the main river draining the southern half of the installation. However, you're probably not going to have skidders or any other equipment directly in the river, so we're talking about indirect impacts here. So again, it's important to know your landscape position. If you're working in a dry upland forest without any tributaries within a certain distance, you're probably going to be pretty safe knowing there's not going to be runoff. However, in such as this situation in a bottomland hardwood forest, if you were doing silvicultural treatments here, you would have to be very cognizant of any sedimentation, because two of the species that are candidate species here are mussels and very susceptible to sedimentation of the waterway. So again, while there will not be direct effects and you're not going to know exactly where the species is, similar to the bat, you have to be cognizant of your landscape in this case. Where are the waterways, where are the tributaries, and how you can eliminate erosion or runoff into these tributaries. And once you do that, then you can probably safely proceed. But you would have to address that in any sort of environmental documentation as you're preparing silvicultural treatments. Okay, so here we are. This is the Nottoway River, again, using this as our final example, a case study here at Fort Pickett. And the Nottoway River contains one federally endangered species, the Roanoke log perch, and several mussels that are candidate species and potentially an endangered species. The point I wanted to make here, especially these southern Piedmont streams like this, the role of woody debris. Woody debris is really important in these systems for bank stabilization, in-stream habitat, and overall water quality because of the species it harbors. It slows down the CFS, or the speed of the water moving through the system, and thus reduces stream bank erosion and stream bottom erosion. So again, even the tops and stuff that you may not use or may not be used after silvicultural treatment, they have a role in providing habitat and protecting water quality, whether it's putting them as bank stabilization within a waterway to reduce erosion, or if a tree happens to fall into the river, it's not necessarily a bad thing from a habitat. So again, down woody debris, very important for aquatic systems as well as terrestrial systems. So with some byproducts of the silvicultural treatment, such as tops in different parts of the tree that are not used, they can play a very important role in mitigating the site, helping other sites nearby and such. In particular, in water systems like this that have a very large component of down woody debris, that actually provides habitat for not only threatened species, but game fish species and any number of other species. In addition, it can provide bank stabilization, slows water rates down to decrease bank erosion and subsurface erosion. So what's left over from a silvicultural treatment actually does have a purpose not only terrestrially but aquatically.